It's nice to be here. It was a gorgeous drive over from the seacoast today. Especially we were on 101 going through Dublin, and the lake was beautiful and the leaves were beautiful. And as you know, we've only got a very short time until the election, and this is going to be a critical election. There are clear differences between my opponent and me on a whole range of issues. But I think the one that's probably most important to people in New Hampshire is that as I have served in Washington, as I did as governor, my focus is to keep New Hampshire first, to do what I can to address the concerns that I hear from people in the state, and whether that's how do we get the vet clinic built in Keene, or how do we address constituents who call who are being foreclosed on because of mortgage issues. It really is about what do we do to try and do what's best for New Hampshire, and I think that's very different than my opponent who's just moved here, who hasn't worked on issues in the state that are important to people here. And then if you look at our records in the Senate, they're different on a lot of issues as well. So I think this election is going to be determined, despite efforts to make this about what's happening at the national level. I believe it's going to be determined by people here who are concerned about what's going to happen in New Hampshire and who can best represent New Hampshire. So that's what we've been talking about, and it's nice to be home, to be able to travel around New Hampshire and to talk to people about what the issues are, and to hear from them their concerns and what they would like to see done.
What concerns are you hearing most about?
They continue to be economic concerns that are the number one question. I was in Peterborough earlier today, and I was talking about the focus of the event was with women. It was on health care, reproductive choice. But the first question was about somebody who said, I'm in the middle class. I'm worried because what we're seeing is that we're struggling, and we're not seeing the benefits of the job growth that the numbers show, because we've got a system that's skewed in a way that doesn't benefit middle-class families anymore. And so I talked about my efforts around student loans, which is a big issue that I hear from a lot of people about. As we know, New Hampshire has the second highest student loan debt in the country, and this is a real concern. I've got legislation with some other senators to try and refinance student loan debt, because right now you can refinance your car, you can refinance your house, but you can't refinance your student loans. So that's one of the things that I'm hearing a lot about, because it's affecting not just young people, but it's affecting the economy, because there's sort of a ripple effect. I met with some realtors earlier this summer, and they were saying that they see that as they look at first-time home buyers, that people are delaying buying houses, often because of student loan debt. So it's the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, which has only been raised once since Jimmy Carter was president, and that's next to mortgages, that's the second biggest expenses for families in New England. It's child care. It's how do we support small businesses for job growth, because that's where about 2/3 of job growth occurs, is with our small businesses. And of course, here in New Hampshire, that's really the foundation of our economy. So those have been, the first issues people raise are what do we do to address the fact that we aren't yet seeing the benefits of the economic recovery in a way that we had hoped to.
With regard to the education issue, cost of education, there is the student loan debt side. Obviously, there's the cost of college education itself. I mean, is there anything, to your view, that we can be doing that we're not doing now? Is a meaningful response to that side of the issue?
This is something that I thought a lot about and worked on a lot when I was governor, because obviously I think access to higher education is not only the key to future prosperity for young people. I mean, we know what all the statistics are about how much better you do if you've got a college education. But it's also about making sure we've got the workforce we need in the future, and whether we're going to be competitive as a state or as a country is really dependent upon how do we do with education. We did several things when I was governor. I would start by saying I applaud the efforts of Governor Hassan and the board of the university system to try and keep tuition from going up. But in thinking about long-term, what can we do? One of the things that I worked on was the articulation agreements between our community colleges and our university system so that you could actually transfer your credits when you started. And that's important because that means students can finish in 4 years instead of 5 or 6. We started the unique college investing program to help students with the cost of higher education so families could begin saving. You know, again, sadly, we saw changes in that after I left office, but in terms of the cost of higher education, you know, there are some radical things that we can think about that I think may work in some places and not others. So as we think about who are we educating, you know, the university system, or UNH Manchester, has a very different physical plant than UNH in Durham, and it also has very different enrollment. So a lot of the students at UNH Manchester are older, they're working, they aren't the right out of high school traditional students, and so they don't necessarily aren't necessarily looking for sports teams and for campus life in the same way that young people who are right out of high school do. And so thinking about, are there places where we can provide the education that students need without needing to do some of the facilities in the way that we have historically. I think College for America that Southern New Hampshire University is doing is a really interesting paradigm in higher education. And thinking about that, you know, one of the things that we talked about when I was governor was, do we need a hospitality degree from UNH and a hospitality degree from Plymouth and a hospitality degree from Keene? I mean, that's I'm making up the course there, but to think about where can we focus in terms of the curriculum in a way that provides opportunities for our young people, but also doesn't necessarily duplicate all of the services that we need to do. So I think having those conversations is probably important as we think about the future and what we need to do in higher education.
Are all of those potential solutions state solutions? Is there something federal government can or should be doing?
Well, I think the federal government should continue to try and help with student cost of education. I supported increasing Pell Grants. I think the efforts to try and address the debt issue that students have incurred, so that looking at, you know, for certain professions, if students go into teaching, I can't remember all of them, but basically public service kinds of occupations, after a certain period of time, their debt is erased as a way to incentivize young people getting into areas where we really need their professional skills. Trying to limit the amount of your earnings that you're paying back for your student loans. That's another program that we've enacted. I think all of those are important, and I think the federal government has an important role to play there. But whether the federal government should dictate to universities and states and private colleges about what they should be doing with respect to providing an education, I would have second thoughts about. I'm not sure that at this point I think that's the right thing to do.
Sort of shifting gears a little bit to foreign policy and more sort of international scope, we're just wondering if you could talk a little bit about your views on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as now the new emerging, very alarming threat of ISIS, and what the administration and Congress is doing to combat that now.
I think ISIS is a threat. I don't know that anybody in New Hampshire would disagree with that after the barbarous murders of Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff. I think that was really personal for most people in New Hampshire who I've talked to. Mm-hmm. And I think the strategy that is being employed currently is one that I support, to build an international coalition that doesn't just include our traditional NATO allies, but also includes Arab and Muslim states. I think that's very important to have them part of the effort, to look at providing air support and other support for Iraqis who are fighting on the ground and for Syrian opposition groups that have been vetted. I supported that legislation, and it got broad support in both the House and Senate, to arm and equip the Syrian vetted opposition groups. And looking at the financing that ISIS has and figuring out how we can address where the money's coming from. I think the airstrikes against their oil, their small oil refineries, was really important. And also looking at taking on the recruitment efforts, because I find it very troubling that we're seeing young Americans and young Europeans going off to fight with a group that's as barbarous as ISIS is. But I don't think we ought to be putting tens of thousands of troops back into Iraq or Syria, for that matter, as an occupying force. I just don't think that makes sense at this time.
What do you think? What do you think the next step would be if these airstrikes don't really seem to stop? And we can't persuade, for instance, the Turks to step up on their border, that kind of thing. What do you see as the next step?
Well, I think we need to wait a little bit and see what kind of response we're having. You know, one of the things that's kind of gotten left out of the equation is that we agreed to provide support for the Iraqis after al-Maliki left, and they have a new prime minister with an effort to form a more inclusive government. And I think that's very important, because hopefully that means that they will actually be able to get support for the army in Iraq. You know, they have about 200,000 members of the Iraqi army, and it's their country. I think it's important for us to support them in this effort, but they should be doing the fighting. And what we've seen is some improvement in their ability to fight. We've seen that the Kurds are very good fighters, and we're seeing that in Syria, for that matter. You know, if only the Turks would let the Kurds go back into Syria to fight in Kobani, that might be very beneficial there. So I think it's important for us to give it a little time to see what happens there. And I also think ultimately it's in Turkey's interest to address what's happening right over its border. And I appreciate that they need to make an independent decision, and they don't want us to be telling them what to do. But ultimately, I have to believe it's going to be in their interest to address what's happening immediately across the border, because they're also affected by the refugees from Syria. I mean, they've got hundreds of thousands of Syrians in Turkey at this point. So I think it's important for us to do that.
We all worry about the potential for another terrorist attack on our soil.
Sure.
Is there anything that weighs more heavily on you with regard to that, whether it's cyber terrorism, attacks on infrastructure, transportation, biological, or is it just a general concern for any and all of that?
Well, I think there's a lot to be concerned about. I think one of the areas that has gotten less attention because it's not as dramatic, or at least the visual effect is not as dramatic as cyber terrorism. But if you listen to some of our leadership, our military leadership, they cite that as one of the things they're most concerned about. And when you listen to the most recent attacks on J.P. Morgan, and the suggestion that those were an effort on the part of the Russians to send us a message that they could get into our records anytime, I think there's reason to be concerned. But, that's why it's important for us to address the threat from ISIS, to have a strategy to do that, to have an international effort to go after the terrorists. I thought the effort at the UN Security Council was very important, the President, and getting China and Russia to sign on and agree that this was an effort they also needed to worry about, was important, because I think it's very important for the United States to provide leadership, but this is not something we're going to address on our own. I don't think this is something we need an international coalition. We need to work together to address this threat from terrorism, because it's not just in the Middle East. The Russians saw it in Chechnya. The Chinese have reasons to be concerned about what's going on within their borders. So it's something that we need to really think about and have a very thoughtful, strategic approach to addressing. And that's true whether it's the cyber attacks, whether it's potential attacks within the United States border. I think our intelligence operations are very important to that. I think I just saw today that in Britain they had broken up a terrorist attempt in Britain. So it's something that we've all got to be vigilant about, and we've got to work together to do it.
You mentioned Russia. What about the situation in Ukraine troubles you the most? And how should we be responding to the downing of the Malaysian jet, the incursion by Russian separatists?
The whole situation troubles me. They're coming in and just taking Ukraine, the Crimea back. I think was very troubling, and it's a violation of international law. That's why I think the sanctions were important. But the sanctions are only effective against Russia if we can get Europeans and other members of the international community to buy in. And they have, it really took the downing of the Malaysian flight in order for the Europeans to come on board with the sanctions regime. And it's having an impact in Russia in terms of their economy. Now, it's not having an impact in terms of Putin's popularity, but I have to believe that over time it will begin to have an impact. But some other things that we ought to be doing is continuing to shore up the former Soviet republics. I've done some work as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, and I chaired the European Affairs Subcommittee for 4 years to try and support Georgia and Moldova and some of the other former Soviet republics, because I think it is important for them to recognize that we have a stake in what's happening in Western Europe. I spent a fair amount of time on the Balkans, where we still have countries that are recovering from the breakup of the Soviet Union and Bosnia from the war in Bosnia. So I think working to support the democratic efforts in those countries is very important in preventing Russia from looking at the next place where they're going to come in. Is it going to be Moldova? Is it going to be Are they going to go back into Georgia? Are they going to look at the Baltics? And so I think that's important for us to do in saying to Putin, it's another form of containment, sort of, that he's not going to get away with doing that again. And with respect to the Ukraine, I think we need to continue to support the government in Kyiv. We need to encourage the continued efforts at a ceasefire. It's been pretty tenuous in the last couple of weeks, and to try and do everything we can to support the Ukrainian government and the Russians and the separatists to come to some peaceful settlement on their own that will keep the conflict from breaking out again into fighting.
So all of these issues that are happening elsewhere in the world, in the Middle East and Ukraine, we have seen during this election season attempts to tie those to our immigration policy. So I'm going to move on to that. You, as pretty much everybody we've talked to, have said that securing our border is a priority. What does that mean to you in specific steps?
I voted for the comprehensive immigration reform bill. I think our immigration system is not working. Whether you're talking about the border, or whether you're talking about the 10 million or so people who are here illegally, or our visa system, which I hear complaints from farmers, from the high-tech community, from tourists about the tourism industry about their concerns. And the bill that passed the Senate, Senator Ayotte and I both voted for it. It passed with a strong bipartisan vote. That addressed all of those aspects of the immigration challenges that we face. And it's been disappointing to me to see the extent to which my opponent and others have tried to misrepresent what's in that bill with respect to border security, because there are a lot of people who were unhappy with the border security provisions in the bill because they are so tough. It provides for about 700 miles of border fencing. It would double the number of border agents. Right now there are about 21,000 plus agents along the border. It would almost double that number, adding 19,000 plus more. As part of the bill, it dramatically increased efforts for surveillance and interdiction efforts. It put in place an e-verify system so that businesses could check people applying for jobs and make sure that they were legal. It has provisions to crack down on employers who are trying to hire people, to make sure they're not hiring people who are here illegally. And then it dealt with the visa system. It dealt with, put in place a system to allow people who are here illegally to get in line behind people who are here legally, and had about a 13-year wait period for them before they could try and move forward to a legal status, and it requires that they pay taxes, that they learn English, and a number of provisions. And I think that bill I didn't like everything in it, but I thought there were provisions in it that were very important, and it was important for us to pass it. And I think the House, if they would take it up tomorrow, could pass it, because the votes are there. But it's a small group of Tea Party folks in the House who have prevented the Speaker from taking it up. At least that's what the reports have been. But I think that bill puts in place very strict measures to deal with our southern border that were important. And it's disappointing to me that my opponent has continued to grandstand on this issue politically. Even the former chair of the Republican Party has said that he's grandstanding. And You know, he's made this a centerpiece of his campaign, and now we find out that he missed the only hearings on the border when he was on the Homeland Security Committee in the Senate. They had 6 hearings on border security, and he missed all of them. And when we raised that, that came up at our debate on Monday. And I raised that concern, and he said, well, I didn't need to go to those hearings. I've been in the National Guard for 35 years. I don't need to learn any more about security. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. We can get you the exact quote, but essentially, he said it was fine to attack me, but he didn't have anything else he needed to learn about this issue.
Do you find the immigration issue resonating in New Hampshire much?
I don't have. When I'm talking to folks as I travel around the state, it's not something that comes up a lot. As I said, I have heard from people in the tourism industry who are concerned about visas for workers as they're trying to bring people in for seasonal work. It's something that we hear from farmers about sometimes, because a lot of people who are in the apple picking industry, for example, are here seasonally, and from the high-tech community. But, you know, before this campaign season, when campaign ads started running, I was not hearing from people about it.
If you were to spend a few days in this region, 3 or 4 days, which you don't have the opportunity to do, one topic that you would hear a lot about, I think, would be energy. It's very much top of mind. I was wondering maybe if you could talk a little bit about your long-term strategic plan for energy, acknowledging that we all agree that it's going to take a diverse mix of energy sources, and also with particular emphasis on nuclear power, given that Vermont Yankee is a few months away from closing, and it is a renewable. And also with regard to natural gas, which in this area we've reported extensively on the growing reliance of it, and yet we have a pipeline shortage. And so trying to just reconciling and squaring all of that with a broader plan.
Well, I agree. I don't think we're going to get off oil in my lifetime, but I think we can change the way we subsidize the oil companies. I don't think we should be doing that anymore, because it's an established industry, and last year the 5 biggest oil companies made over $90 billion in profit. They don't need the subsidies that we're giving them, and that we should take some of those dollars and use them to promote more alternative sources of energy and new energy technologies. It's also a place where there are a lot of jobs, and they're homegrown jobs. In New Hampshire, we have a number of small businesses that are doing really interesting things in the energy area. One is a company called SustainX down in Seabrook, which used to actually be up in the Hanover area. It's people who were at Dartmouth, and they've taken technology that they learned there, and it's an energy storage company. One of the big challenges we have with solar and wind and some of the renewables is there's no storage capacity, because we don't know how to store that energy. So we can get a lot of wind on a windy day, but how do we use it when it's not windy? Well, having that storage capacity would make a huge difference. They're piloting with Unitil on a project and creating a number of jobs as part of that. Another company that's really interesting, I think, is Warner Power, where they've developed a new transformer. 40% of our energy use is in buildings, and they've got a transformer that is the first innovation in transformers in over 100 years, called a hexaformer, that they think has tremendous possibilities to save energy. So I think we've got to look at how do we invest in some of those areas where it's going to provide us more options in the future, and where we can actually benefit in savings. I have legislation with Rob Portman, and he's a Republican from Ohio. We've been working on this legislation for 3.5 years now. It's the Energy Efficiency and Industrial Competitiveness Act is the official term. It's also called Shaheen-Portman. And there's been a fair amount written about it, because we thought we were going to be able to get it passed this spring, and it didn't. Actually, we weren't able to get the votes to break the filibuster, and Scott Brown was one of the people who was cited as trying to keep the bill from passing because of the political implications. But regardless of that, I think we're going to get this bill passed. And what it does is put in place energy efficiency strategy for the country. And the reason that's important, and I know it's, you know, for people who are looking at energy issues, efficiency isn't as sexy as, you know, wind and solar and some of the other energy opportunities. But in the last 40 years, we have saved more energy through efficiency than we have produced through fossil fuels and nuclear power combined in this country. So that gives you some idea of the potential. And we have barely scratched the surface here. And what our bill would do is deal with the building sector, or the manufacturing sector, which is the biggest user of energy, and then government, which is the biggest user of energy in the country. And if we were able to pass it tomorrow, by 2030 it would help create 200,000 jobs, save consumers over $16 billion a year, and be the equivalent of taking 22 million cars off the road. Now, to give you an example closer to home, when I was governor, we started retrofitting state buildings for energy efficiency. And now we're saving taxpayers between $2 and $4 million annually on the energy bill for the state. And we're saving thousands of pounds of pollution because of that. So there are a number of things like that we can and should be doing that are low-hanging fruit, that it doesn't matter if you support fossil fuels or you support alternatives. Everybody can agree on efficiency because, you know, everybody benefits. And we ought to be starting with that. And, you know, I think there are lots of other things we can do, but that's one place that I would start because I think we can get some agreement ultimately. On the pipeline, when I was governor, we permitted 2 pipelines across New Hampshire, one that came down from Canada and one that came across from Maine. And it took some time. You know, we have a process to do that, but we got it done, and we need to continue to work on those processes. I think there are 2 companies that are looking to permit pipelines through New Hampshire, and you know, they're just starting that process. But when you look at, you know, in 2000, when I was governor, we were only dependent on gas for, I can't remember, it was probably about 15% of our energy in New Hampshire. And now, if you look at the gas-fired generation that we have in the state, it's up to about 50%, I think. And we can get you the exact numbers because I've got them. But, you know, obviously, we have traded our dependence on oil and coal for being too heavily dependent on gas at this point. And what we need is a diverse set of options. So we're using a variety of things. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, but the potential is significant, and the potential for job growth is significant. And again, I think we should take some of those subsidies we're given to the oil companies and put them into some of these other options.